Good morning. Today's topic is speech. You all know what is basically speech. Speech is actually one of our higher functions. We can say basically speech is very complicated and it is very layered form of communication because of our well-developed cerebral cortex, and some areas of cerebral cortex is actually dedicated for the speech. Actually, speech is basically an expression of our thoughts in the form of language. So there are certain areas of the cortex which are dedicated for the language function, that is for the speech. That may be the reason why we can communicate in the form of language in a more complex, layered way. So what we basically see today is what is the basic neural mechanism which is happening when we are perceiving the speech, or when you are hearing, or when you are seeing the written form of language, how we are comprehending it, which are the areas involved in the comprehension or perception of the speech, how we are analyzing it, and also how we are responding or talking back, or how we are expressing our thought process, or how we are responding back with the form of language, and how the speech is executed. So that is basically the neural mechanism of speech. Then we can see some abnormalities of the speech mechanism, which is basically the aphasias. So as you can see in the picture, you can see this area, you can see it is labeled as word formation, the other area which is labeled as language comprehension. So this area is basically helping to perceive the speech and analyze and understand the speech, and that is why it is known as the sensory speech area or Wernicke's area. You can see it is a part of the temporal cortex. You can see it is a part of temporal cortex. It is a part of the parietal lobe, which is basically in the temporoparietal junction. That is the sensory speech area. And motor speech area, you can see that is basically the Broca's area, which is there in the posterior inferior part of the frontal lobe. So this is the motor speech area. So these are the two basic areas which are involved in the language or speech processing as well as expression. That is the cortical areas associated with speech. Next, you can see what actually make you different from the chimpanzees, which are our closest evolutionary ancestors, we can say. So what you can see is we have a well-developed cerebral cortex, and you can see the area which is dedicated for the language or the speech function is more compared to the chimpanzees. You can see it is smaller here. We have a well-developed language or the speech area. That may be the reason why we can speak more complex way in the form of language compared to the other animals. Then when you speak about the cerebral cortex, you have right and left cerebral hemispheres, and the cerebral cortex is there, but not two cerebral cortexes are equally having the speech or the language representation in the cortex, and that is how it is divided into what is known as the dominant or categorical hemisphere, and the other hemisphere is known as non-dominant or representational hemisphere. What is dominant hemisphere is, we know most of the people are right-handed. So for the right-handed individuals, as for everything there is crossing left hemisphere is the dominant of the categorical hemisphere. But we take the whole population also, we have left-handed individuals also. They are a minority, but what is the thing is, even though a person is right-handed or left-handed, mostly the dominant or the categorical hemisphere is the left cerebral hemisphere, And the importance is the dominant or the categorical hemisphere, Broca's and the Wernicke's area is associated with speech. And the other cortex is actually the representational hemisphere, which is usually associated with the temporospatial relationship, artistic performances are which are usually associated with the representational hemisphere. So why this is important is when we see the right hemiplegic individuals, which is due to the left cerebral cortical lesions, that individual usually has this language dysfunction, or it is known as aphasia. We'll discuss it later. So just remember this, almost all right-handed individuals and also 70% of left-handed individuals, the dominant hemisphere or the categorical hemisphere is the left hemisphere, and in that cortex we have this language function areas. So whenever there is a dysfunction of the left cerebral cortex, which usually causes right hemiplegia, which is usually associated with language dysfunction, which is not usually seen in left-sided hemiplegia due to right cortical lesions. So just keep in mind that language function is usually in the dominant hemisphere or the categorical hemisphere. Now what is speech? You all know it is a complex layered way of communication in the form of language, or an abstract way of communication in the form of language. We all know for everything we have a name, every object, every emotions, everything we have a name in the form of language. So in that abstract name we are actually doing the communication in a layered way. So if you are taking the verbal speech, which is the actual speech form, which is the verbal output or the output in the form of sound in the form of a language. But as we have a written form also, we usually call it as a written speech, which is a symbolic representation which can be seen in as the visual representation of the language. So we can say we have spoken language, spoken speech, as well as written speech. So we usually say the spoken speech or the sound form of speech as the actual speech. The other thing is just a symbolic representation in the form of written thing, which is perceived in the visual through the visual pathway. And when we say about the development of speech or the language, we usually learn the language in the childhood. When we born after 1 year, 1 to 1.5 years, we start speaking small words in the form of our native language or any other language we can speak. So what the child learn in the first stage is we have a word for this thing or that thing, and that is the word learning is the actual thing which is happening in the first stage, and this word is associated with a particular visual, auditory, tactile or other sensory stimulation or the emotional thing. So the word learning is the first thing the child is learning first. So word is actually an abstract representation of a certain thing or a fact or an emotion or anything. So basically the word learning happens first, and child slowly start associating this sound, this spoken sound, with different form of sensations, visual, auditory things. So what basically happens is when you learn a word for a particular thing, the child actually develop the synaptic connection between this particular form of sensory input with this word. So when you hear the word glass, you have a picture of the glass. You can see this thing is actually the glass for the glass you have visual representation, or the actual glass is there that you can see, and you know what is it made of. It is easily breakable when you touch it, how it feels, and there are different shapes of glass. Everything is coming into your mind when you hear this word glass by the way of synaptic connection, which is growing into different areas of the cortex when you actually learn the language. So that is how the development of speech or language occurs. That is usually happening in the childhood. And we usually say it is easy to learn different languages, as many languages as possible in the childhood, because during childhood you are actually hearing this abstract word for a particular thing, and you are learning it, and you are associating it with different types of sensory information, and it is very easy to learn. So if the child is learning only the native language, and later in the adulthood if the child is learning another language, what we do is we usually form the association between these two words. There is not the actual development of language happening in the adulthood. We actually form the association between these two words. That is why the actual learning of language is more easy in the childhood than the adulthood. Now we can see what actually happens in the brain when you are learning the speech, and how we are perceiving the speech, how we are analyzing, and how we are responding to speech. So we can, for easy purpose, we can divide the neural mechanism of speech into two distinct processes. As we all know, that is the perception of speech, that is how we are perceiving the speech, how we are analyzing it, how we are understanding the speech, that is the perception of speech. Next is the expression of speech, and that means how we are forming the words and how the output of the speech is happening. And we all know, only we hear the sound or the word, you can speak it back. That means if a child is congenitally deaf, child will not speak, and that is why the childhood deafness has to be corrected as early as possible. The speech is only possible if the child is hearing the sound. And we can see the brain areas which are involved in the language is actually surrounding the sylvian fissure. You can see the sylvian fissure, it is surrounding the sylvian fissure. You have the sensory speech area as well as the motor speech area. So in this picture you can see clearly the language dedicated areas. This is the sensory speech area. You can see it is in the inferior part of the parietal cortex, or posterior inferior part of the parietal cortex. That is our sensory speech area, or the Wernicke's area. And you can see in the frontal lobe, posterior inferior part of the frontal lobe, you have the motor speech area or the Broca's area. And we definitely need connection between these two, then only the speech which is heard is decoded, understood, should be connected to the motor speech, then only you can speak back to what work question you are getting, and you can only respond to the speech only because of this connection. That means the understanding of the speech happens here, that is sensory speech area, and it is connected to the motor speech area or the Broca's area. Remember, Wernicke's area is in the parietal lobe and Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and this connection is there, that is known as the arcuate fasciculus. Okay, so that are the language areas or speech areas in the cortex. Now we can see how the perception of speech or the understanding of the speech happens. We all know the language input can be either visually in the form of written language, or the other thing is the actual speech, that is the auditory thing. So how we are perceiving the spoken words is, you are hearing the word, which is basically an auditory stimuli, and the auditory stimuli is usually going through the auditory cortex. It reaches into the auditory cortex by the auditory pathway, and this auditory area is there in the temporal lobe or superior temporal gyrus, and from there it has to be communicated to the Wernicke's area, that is our sensory speech area. Okay, so when we are hearing the sound in the form of language, it goes through the auditory pathway, reaches the primary auditory area, and through a gateway it is going into the Wernicke's area, or the area for the language perception in the form of auditory language. Okay, so you can see here, this is our Wernicke's area. So when you are hearing the sound, it reaches the primary auditory area through the auditory pathway. From there it is communicated to the Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area decodes what is there in this language, and it's meaningfully understand the content of the speech. Okay, and we already learned the language from the childhood, and when we reach in the early childhood itself, we have already know what is the meaning of the written as well as the language we are hearing, what is actually it means. And when we hear the word glass, you can see the synaptic connections are already formed by the language learning process in the childhood. So when you hear this word glass, an example, Wernicke's area is receiving the word glass, you get the synapse activated, and you will get a picture of glass in your mind. You will get the ting ting sound of the glass when you are tapping it. You can actually feel the glass, the smooth feel of the glass. You can actually see the shining of the glass when the light is passing through the glass, and this much area is synaptic area is activated, and you can actually imagine a glass in your mind, and you can hear the sound of the glass ting ting. Everything you can see because of this connections, that is synaptic connection, which is already formed during the language learning process. So that is how you perceive the speech. So remember, when you are hearing a word, actually you are not hearing the word, you are actually hearing the language and the meaning of it, and different types of sensory stimuli which are associated with, and you know what the glass is made of. There are different types of glass. Glass is made of glass, glass is made of steel, different types of glass are. Everything can be come into your mind due to the language learning process. So you can see the layers of these things which is happening with single word glass. So that is how the perception of the spoken language. Same thing is shown here. You have the auditory area which is first receiving it, and through the planum temporal actually it is going into the Wernicke's area, and it is going to the Broca's area through the arcuate fasciculate, and we are speaking back with the help of the motor cortex. Okay, and the next picture you can see, when you are seeing a written word, that is the symbolic representation of language that you are seeing as the visual thing through the visual pathway. It will reach into the visual cortex, that is in the occipital cortex. From there it has to reach into the Wernicke's area. So here also you have another gateway which is the angular gyrus. So from the primary visual area through the angular gyrus it reach into the Wernicke's area. So you are seeing the written form glass, GLASS. You are seeing it, and your visual area is communicating it to the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area understand this GLASS. I have already learned this. I know this is glass, and all the connections are activated, and the glass thing, the abstract thing is coming into your mind. This is the meaning of glass. This is the texture of glass. Everything will come into the mind. Okay, only the input into the Wernicke's area is through the visual area. In the other spoken thing, it is through the auditory area. Okay, same thing, visual pathway, visual association through the angular gyrus, it is coming to the Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area, understand this is the meaning of this symbol in the form of language, which you have already learned during the childhood. Okay, and very few words about the Wernicke's area. As we all know, we have a lot of numbers. Brodmann's area, here it is 22. It is very easy to learn the number. Wernicke's area is 22 and Broca's area is 44. Okay, so your sensory speech area is here, that is area number 22, and this area is Broca's area is motor speech area, that is 44. Okay, so that is the sensory speech area. So that is in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, very close to the auditory area, and that is how it is easily communicated from the auditory sound is communicated to the Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is actually doing the meaningful interpretation of the words you are hearing. Okay, same thing, you have the Wernicke's area here, which is in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus in the junction with the parietal cortex, area number 22, which meaningfully understands the contents of the sound you are hearing in the form of language. And if it is the written form of language, it is receiving from the visual area, it is reaching into the Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is actually decoding the language as the meaning. Okay, now you can see the arcuate fasciculus, which actually communicates the meaning which is decoded in the Wernicke's area to the Broca's area, so that you can create the output to the speech, or you can express the words out in the form of language. So this is the connection, that is the arcuate fasciculus. Okay, so that is your perceiving the speech or understanding the speech. So for that you have the Wernicke's area. Now the question is, how will you produce the speech, or how will you express the speech in the form of language? Okay, so same thing, you can express it either as the spoken word, that is our usual speech, or you can write it down. So like perception, you have both output as the verbal output or the symbolic representation in the form of writing or the written words. So whether it is verbal output or written output, both is basically a motor activity. So this sound you are hearing or the symbol you are receiving through the visual system is understood by the Wernicke's area. This is the meaning of this information in the form of language, and that will be communicated to the Broca's area by the arcuate fasciculus, and Broca's area actually decides the words, put it in sentences, in meaningful sentences, put it in correct grammar. Everything is done by the expression, whole expression production is done by the motor speech area or the Broca's area. Then it has to be converted into a actual motor activity, whether it is a spoken thing or a written thing. So the output is basically a well integrated motor activity. So that is also actually a part of language learning. So in the childhood, we actually learn how to speak a word, how's the pronunciation, how's the tone of the speech, and you can change the tone according to the emotion. And like that, when you are writing it, how the letter is written, what is the spelling, what is the grammar, present tense, past tense, everything you learn in the childhood. So basically the output is a motor activity. So you have the motor speech area, area number 44, Brodmann's area number 44, or the Broca's area, which is located in the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so which actually select the words arranged in meaningful sentences with the grammar. Okay, so the articulatory components, what words should be spoken out, how it should be arranged, and the articulatory component is basically made by the Broca's area, and that is why it is known as the motor speech area. Now, to speak out or to write, we need the help of the motor mechanism. That means the whole motor system. That means we need the motor cortex, we need the pyramidal tract, and also we need the basal ganglia, we need the cerebellum. All these things are involved in the motor activity, as we need a well coordinated motor thing to speak out or to write it down. Okay, so you can see the Broca's area here. This is Broca's area, which is in the lower part of the frontal lobe, area number 42. Remember, Wernicke is 22 and Broca is 44. Okay, so that is the motor speech area. And like the gateway as the planar temporal or the angular gyrus, Broca's area is also something have a writing center which is there in the middle frontal gyrus, which can be considered as the motor writing center, which is basically connected to the Broca's area, which is known as the Exner's center. Okay, so from the Broca's area, so you have the Broca's area here. From the Broca's area, information has to be given to the motor cortex. So this is the prefrontal gyrus. Here you have the motor area, so the information has to be passed to the motor area so that adequate motor activity is given out, so that you can move the fingers or you can move the lips, the pharyngeal muscles, tongue muscles, so that the written form of speech or the speech, the actual speech is coming out. Okay, so what Broca's area is doing is it's actually producing the articulatory component for the motor system to execute the speech. How the actual execution of speech happens is, just imagine how you are speaking out. You are actually taking a deep inspiration before you are start speaking, and you are actually modulating your expired air to produce the sound. Okay, so a respiratory coordination is very, very important in producing the speech. Okay, so the motor whole cortical areas, whole motor cortex, basal ganglia and cerebellum is involved in the speech, as it is a coordinated motor activity. So you need the respiratory control. You have to inspire, then you have to expire, and you have to modify the expiratory air with the help of vocal cords to produce the sound. So that is known as the phonation. Your vocal cords vibrate when you are making the sound, when you are expiring. Okay, that produces the phonation. Then comes the articulation and resonation. Articulation is basically pa, la. So when you are making the sound, you are articulating. Your temporomandibular joint is moving, your lips are moving, your tongues are moving. For different letters, different muscles are moving. You are touching the soft palate with your tip of tongue. So it is a complicated motor activity which has to be well coordinated. Okay, that is articulation. Joint movement and muscle movement is basically the articulation. And final comes the resonation. We all know when you get sinusitis or when you have a blocked nostrils, complete resonation of the sound will be changed, and the quality of sound is changed. So that is basically resonate. So it resonates in the cranial cavity, basically in the paranasal sinuses. Okay, so that resonation is there. So you have to control the respiration, you have to move the vocal cords, that is the phonation, you have to articulate the air which is coming out with the help of lips, tongue and the pharynx, and your temporomandibular joint should move. Then finally it has to resonate. Okay, so this is the basic thing happens. So you have, when you are expressing, you have the Broca's area which actually forms the words, arrange it. If output is actually made in the Broca's area and it is passed into the motor cortex, and we know cerebellum and basal ganglia is involved in the execution of all motor activities, and this is connected to the respiratory center, going to the respiratory muscles, especially diaphragm. You have inspiration, then you are expiring and modifying the expiration, so you should have well control over your respiratory muscles. Then it goes through the pyramidal tract, it moves the laryngeal muscles, moves the palate, pharynx, facial muscles, lips, everything is moved. Okay, and that is how you are speaking. Okay, if you want to write through the pyramidal tract, it goes into the hand muscles and you are writing down. Okay, so to speak or to write down in the childhood, you should learn. So basically you have a motor learning process also which is happening, and that is you are speaking fluently and writing in a faster way when you are the adult. Okay, respiratory control, I have already told you, the expired air which is coming through the upper respiratory tract has to be modified, and that actually produce the sound when it is passing through the vocal cords, when the vocal cord vibrates, and that is basically phonation. So when the vibration of vocal cord happens, it produces the intonation and inflection of the spoken words. So phonation is basically under the control of the vocal cord which is there in the larynx, and in anatomy you will learn what are the laryngeal muscles involved in the abduction, adduction, and what is the importance of recurrent laryngeal nerve. As when you have thyroid surgery, sound is completely lost, you have seen. That is usually because of this recurrent laryngeal nerve is cut off accidentally, or recurrent laryngeal nerve paralysis. So vocal cord won't be able to move properly. That is how the patient is not able to produce the sound. Okay, and comes the articulation. We have already seen the articulation, and just see the cranial nerves involved. To say pa, you need lips, which is under the control of the facial nerve, 7th cranial nerve. To say pa, you need the movement of palate, 9th and 10th nerve. To say ta, you need tongue. Okay, so that is the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So these are the cranial nerves which are involved in the articulation of the muscles of the palate, tongue and the facial muscles, especially the lips and the cheek muscles. Okay, so you need the motor cortical mechanism, which you need the cerebellum, you need the basal ganglia, which is the motor controlling apparatus, which should have a fine control over these muscles to speak normally and fluently. Finally comes the resonation, which is happening in the nose, nasopharynx and in the paranasal sinuses. Okay, so that is how the speech is executed with the help of respiration, with the help of larynx and with the help of articulatory mechanism, and finally the resonation. So when we test a patient's speech that we discussed in the last practical class, in the higher functions we should test the patient's speech. Actually we need not actually test the patient's speech. We will understand whether the patient is normally speaking, whether the patient is understanding your speech with the normal conversation. But when you are listening to the patient's speech, you should check whether the person is actually comprehend mere speech. That means whether the patient is understanding meaningfully what you are saying, then whether the patient is talking fluently, and whether the patient can repeat the same sentence again, and whether the patient can name all the objects, whether the patient can both read and write, to test whether both the written as well as the spoken languages function. So these are the components we usually to look for when the patient is usually speaking, and if it is abnormal we have to pick up which component is actually missing for the patient. Okay, so that is the normal speech is happening, how we perceive and how we execute the speech. Now we can see some abnormalities in the language mechanism or in the speech mechanism. Okay, it is very simple. If our cortical mechanism, that means our Wernicke's area is here, Broca's area is here, our connection is here. So if there is something wrong with this cortical speech associated areas, that is known as aphasia. Okay, so the language related or speech related cortical apparatus is abnormal. The abnormality produced by it is known as aphasia. Okay, so aphasia can be of different types. Sometimes the patient may not be understanding the speech meaningfully. Patient is not understanding, not able to perceive the speech normally, maybe due to the problem in the Wernicke's area. So you can call it as a sensory aphasia. Okay, sometimes patient is understanding everything, but patient is not able to form adequate words or speak it out. Okay, so that may be the problem in our Broca's area, or sometimes the arcuate fasciculate is abnormal, so the idea which is formed here will not be communicated with the Broca's area. Okay, so if this apparatus is abnormal, you can call it as aphasia. Remember, which usually happens when there is something wrong in the left or dominant or the categorical hemisphere due to the usual vascular things or neoplasms or tumors. Vascular events means thrombosis, embolism, hemorrhage, which can occur, which can affect the cortex and which can cause aphasia. Okay, so speech can also be affected, as I have already told, if the child is congenitally deaf or congenitally blind. Blind person may not be able to write the written form symbols correctly. Like that, if the person is not hearing any words, congenitally deaf, a person may not be able to speak the language form. So that type of abnormality is usually not considered as aphasia. Aphasia means you have a normal visual function, you have a normal auditory function, everything is normal, but this language processing area is abnormal. That means our Wernicke's area, the connection or the Broca's area is abnormal. That produces abnormality is usually known as aphasia. Okay. So the types of aphasia I have already told you. You can have sensory aphasia, that means the patient is not understanding the perception of speech is abnormal. That means the problem is usually in the Wernicke's area. Or it can be motor aphasia, the problem is in the Broca's area, or it can be conduction aphasia. Conduction means Wernicke's connection to Broca's is something wrong with the connection, that is our arcuate fasciculus, that is known as conduction aphasia. Then there can be global aphasia when all these things are affected due to massive bleed or thrombosis, that is known as global aphasia. And sometimes we can see specific thing that is known as anomic aphasia. Everything is normal, patient is speaking normally, fluently, meaningfully understand, person can write, read, everything is normal, but patient may not be able to name a thing, that is known as anomic aphasia. So these are different types of aphasia: sensory or Wernicke's, motor or Broca's, conduction aphasia when the arcuate fasciculus is affected, or global aphasia when both are affected, or anomic aphasia, everything is normal but patient may not be able to name the thing. Okay, sensory aphasia. What happens in sensory aphasia is, that means how the patient's speech will look like in Wernicke's aphasia or sensory aphasia is, patient will be hearing what you are talking, but patient will be talking back excessively, but the speech doesn't have much meaning. Patient may be talking excessively, but that may not be a response to your verbal command, or may not be speaking back to what you are asking to the patient. So that is known as jargon speech. ഇല്ലാത്ത വാക്കുകളൊക്കെ പറയും, that is known as neologisms. Okay, new words, പുതിയ വാക്കുകളെ കണ്ടുപിടിച്ച് പറഞ്ഞാൽ. അപ്പോൾ patient will be speaking fluently, but speech may be nonsense, that doesn't make any sense, that doesn't have any meaning, and also patient may find new words to speak out. So these are the features of sensory aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. Okay, so basically the comprehension of speech or understanding the meaning of the language is lost due to abnormality in the Wernicke's area. What happens in motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia is, which is basically the non-fluent aphasia. Patient is understanding what you are telling. Wernicke's area is normal. Conduction to Broca's area is normal. So patient is completely understanding what you are speaking. But what happens is, Broca's area is actually producing the words which has to be spoken out. That is abnormal. So patient will understand your speech, but patient will not get words to speak out. That is why it is a non-fluent aphasia. So patient will be speaking only very few words that will be meaningful, but the verbal output will be very less. So that is known as telegraphic speech, and very small words the patient will be speaking. Okay, but patient will be understanding whatever you are telling, or whatever is written patient will understand, because the Wernicke's area is completely normal. The perception of speech is completely normal, but the output is abnormal. And as the motor area is actually making the words, arranging with grammar, everything, the output is made. The output, the grammar related output is abnormal. So that is another feature of Broca's aphasia. Okay, now what happens in conduction aphasia is, you have a good Wernicke's area, good Broca's area, but connection is lost. So patient will be understanding whatever you are telling, meaningfully understand, but that won't be communicated with the motor area. So patient will be talking excessively. Whatever you are telling, the patient is understanding, but as it is not connected to the motor area, patient will be talking fluently with a lot of words, and sometimes inappropriate words will be talking about. So this is also a type of fluent aphasia. What happens in global aphasia is, all aspects of speech is affected, both comprehension, output, everything is affected. So patient will be completely silent. Sometimes some understanding, something is, or if it is not complete, otherwise patient will say hi, yes, small words patient will speak out, that may not be contextual or something like that. So that is the total language function is affected. That is global aphasia. Anomic aphasia, already told you, patient is completely understanding the speech, patient is talking, everything is perfect, but as there is problem in the angular gyrus, patient won't be able to find the appropriate words for a particular thing. That is known as anomic aphasia, or sometimes known as nominal aphasia. Naming is abnormal. So when the patient is seeing something, patient is seeing a glass, pen, patient won't be able to find out the appropriate word for this visual information. So the basically angular gyrus, which is very important in processing the language related visual information, is affected. That is why the patient may not be able to name the things. All the other areas of speech is normal. Completely understanding the speech, patient is able to read, write, everything is normal, but the naming of the object is usually affected. Okay, so that is all about aphasia. So remember, when the cortical area which is associated with speech is abnormal, you call it as aphasia. Sensory is there, motor aphasia is there, global aphasia is there, conduction aphasia when the arcuate fasciculus is affected, and nominal aphasia is there. That is about the cortical mechanism. Okay. Now, speech can also be abnormal with the lower things. There can be dysarthria, difficulty in articulation. That usually happens when you have 7th cranial nerve, 7, 9, 10, 12 cranial nerve paralysis. If the patient have facial nerve paralysis, patient may not be able to say pa parayumba, air will be escaping, like then patient will be ha. Okay, patient may not be able to close the mouth properly. Or if there is something abnormal in the temporomandibular joint, or if the tongue is paralyzed due to hypoglossal nerve paralysis, patient may not be able to say, patient may be able to say pa, ba, but patient may not be able to say ta, la. Patient may not be able to pronounce this word. So the problem is in the articulation, the muscles or the joints. Next is the dysphonia that usually happens in the laryngeal disease. I have already mentioned the recurrent laryngeal paralysis as a complication of thyroid surgery or any tumor growing which can compress the recurrent laryngeal nerve, can cause hoarseness of voice. Hypothyroidism, accumulation of myxomatous tissue in the larynx produces kara sound, hoarseness. Same quality happens when there is recurrent laryngeal nerve paralysis. That means your vocal cords are not moving properly. That is known as dysphonia. Remember, phonation is in the larynx, articulation is here, that is in the pharynx, mouth, tongue, lips. Dysarthria I have already told, that is problem in the motor thing, which can be the paralysis of muscles, or it can be incoordination. It can be as a part of the paralysis. As I have already told you, it can happen with hemiplegia, sometimes due to the cortical problem or due to the difficulty in the movement of the muscles which are needed for writing or speaking out. Okay. Or it can be a cerebellar lesion, incoordination. Patient may not be able to talk in a coordinated way. Staccato speech എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞില്ലേ, തിരുവനന്തപുരം എന്ന് പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ല, തിരുവനന്തപുരം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സ്കാനിങ് സ്പീച്ച് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയും. സെറിബെല്ലാർ ലീഷൻസ് പെറുക്കി പെറുക്കി പറയും. Okay, so you need the whole motor system, that is the pyramidal system, extrapyramidal system, cerebellar basal ganglia thing for the proper smooth coordinated way of speech or in the written form. Okay, then another abnormality which is usually dyslexia is usually a learning disability. So when there is learning disability, it can affect the language, especially writing or speeches. The spoken thing is usually not affected, but the writing thing, the intellectual process, the calculation, word processing is affected in dyslexia. Okay, dyslexia is a vast topic, you can go and read. So agraphia means spelling, grammar abnormalities there. So there are a lot of different types of language dysfunction is there. So basically what all things you have to understand is what are the cortical areas which are involved in the perception of speech as well as the execution of speech, how the speech is executed out. That means when you are hearing the word, it is going through the auditory pathway to the auditory cortex, going to the Wernicke's area. If you are seeing the word in the form of symbols as in language, through the visual pathway, it goes to the visual cortex, go to the Wernicke's area. Wernicke's actually analyzes this information, both auditory as well as visual information, meaningfully understand. That is why it is known as the sensory speech area. Then it is connected to the Broca's area through the arcuate fasciculus, and Broca's area is actually the motor speech area, which actually forms the words, put it in arrange in sentences with meaning, with grammar, with tense, present tense, past tense. Everything is done by the Broca's area. So the articulatory component is made by the Broca's area, which is communicated with the motor cortex, respiratory muscles, respiratory centers, cerebellum, basal ganglia, and you are modifying the expiration with the laryngeal muscles. Your vocal cords are vibrating, you are phonating it, it is articulated in the pharynx, tongue, and by the lips, the facial muscle is coming out. If it is written through the pyramidal tract, is going to the hand, and with the help of pyramidal tract, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, you are writing it down. So that is the neural mechanism. And you have to see what happens in aphasia. When the Wernicke's area of 22 is abnormal, you get sensory aphasia. Patient will be speaking. Patient will be speaking a lot. Patient won't be understanding what you are saying. And the connection or the arcuate fasciculus is affected, you get conduction aphasia. When the Broca's area is affected, you get motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. When all this apparatus is lost, you get global aphasia. And when all these things are normal, when the angular gyrus is abnormal, what you get is nominal aphasia. Everything is normal, but patient may not be able to name it. Okay. So these are the things you have to understand. Then what happens in dysarthria, which are cranial nerves are involved in the articulation also, and see what happens when there is abnormality in the larynx. That's all about